The Twilight Zone is known for some of the best twists in television and film history, and Time Enough at Last might be the most well known, even more so than classics like To Serve Man.
To Serve Man, it's a cookbook!
Written by Rod Serling and based off the short story of the same name by Lynn Venable, Time Enough at Last follows Henry Bemis, a man whose only passion in life is to read. However, a cataclysmic event may stand in the way of one man and his books. The story begins with Henry Bemis, a bank teller with the biggest Coke bottle glasses you'll ever see, and an insatiable need to read. His love of reading is so great that he can't even focus on giving Mrs. Chester her money. Instead, he's more focused on his books. Henry goes on about the book David Copperfield and its villainous Miss Murdstone, when Mrs. Chester tells him he still owes her $1.
There's only 24 here, and there should be 25.
Henry is so into his book that even when she points this out, it still takes him a second to realize what she's saying. The best part is he nearly calls her Miss Murdstone the villain of his book, simply due to the fact that she's agitated that he isn't paying any attention. Henry even continues on telling this miserable woman about the book and doesn't even notice when she leaves in a huff. To make sure he doesn't have to deal with any more annoying customers who just want to withdraw or deposit their money, Henry places a sign that reads "Next window please." However, his boss, Mr. Carsville, isn't remotely impressed with his employee's work ethic and calls him into his office.
I don't suppose you've ever read David Copperfield, have you?
No, Mr. Bemis, I have not.
No, but he did make him watch the Statue of Liberty disappear. Mr. Carsville basically gives Henry a rundown of what he's expected to do as a bank teller, and it's hard to argue with the man. If you had an employee that did absolutely nothing but read and cause all the work to pile up on everyone else, then what is even the point of having that employee?
You, Mr. Bemis, are a reader.
A reader?
It's interesting how he says reader like it's a bad thing. Mr. Carsville doesn't like that he reads so much and even chastises him for reading in the vault on his lunch break. Now, reading in the vault might not be the best place to do some reading. Sure, it's quiet, but I'm not sure I would trust any employee just hanging out with all the money. However, it is Henry's lunch break, so who is Mr. Carsville to tell him what he can or can't do? Mr. Carsville even goes as far as threatening Henry with his job if he doesn't stop his reading, and Henry's response to it all? Well, he reads at work because his wife won't let him read at home. She removes newspapers from him, hides the magazines, and even takes ketchup bottles away so he won't read the labels. It's a very bizarre situation to be in, and yet Mr. Carsville thinks Henry's wife is actually in the right. Hilariously, Henry even got in trouble once when reading the presidential campaign buttons on a young lady's lapel, because she thought he was staring at something else.
It's just that I never got a chance to tell her that I was only looking to see who she voted for.
When Henry is at home and relaxing, we get to see just how lovely his dear wife Helen really is. She immediately removes a newspaper from his hands and then goes on about how she won't stand for a husband who can't have a conversation. But can someone fill me in on what kind of conversation she expects to have when she has nothing to talk about? I get the feeling Henry could go on about various things due to all of his reading, but what about his wife?
No, dear, it was just that you said, a husband of mine. Well, how many husbands have you got? You've only got me.
Henry makes a critical error when correcting how his wife talks. Now she really isn't gonna let him read. Instead of reading, they're going over to the Phillips house to play cards, which I don't think Henry is really a fan of. As Henry's wife leaves to apply her green face paint, Henry pulls out a secret book of poetry that his stupid wife knew absolutely nothing about.
Henry?
Oh god, she is terrifying. She's not that stupid, however, because she knows he's hiding the book in his jacket. Strangely, Helen asks him to read her some of the poetry, which should immediately raise a red flag, because this woman never wants him reading anything. When he tries to, he notices every single page has been crossed out, so he can't read any of it. I don't know what Henry saw in this woman, but she is not mentally stable. She takes things even further by tearing the pages out of the book.
Why, Helen? Why do you do these things?
A question I think we're all asking. At work the next day, Henry takes his lunch and some reading material and heads down to the vault, where Mr. Carsville explicitly told him not to do his reading. At this point, I'm wondering if Henry isn't trying to get fired. While in the vault, Henry is reading some rather interesting material. H-bomb capable of total destruction? Gem thieves strike in London fog? That wasn't a bomb, that was just Mr. Carsville finding out where Henry is. After what felt like a massive earthquake, Henry leaves the vault to discover everything is completely destroyed. Who knew that newspaper article would be so on the mark? As Henry walks amongst the rubble of what used to be the bank, he hears a very familiar voice, the final recording of his boss, Mr. Carsville. I love how creepy this scene is. It's just the voice of Mr. Carsville recording a speech, and all we see of him is his hand holding the microphone. We don't need a shot of his mangled body, just his hand clutching the mic and the wedding band on his finger. I think this also serves to humanize Mr. Carsville a bit more. Even though he was a little fed up with Henry, he was also married and could have had children, which makes the whole event even more tragic. An interesting change in this compared to the short story is besides Mr. Carsville's hands, we don't see anyone else. Obviously, it would have been too graphic to show the reality of the situation, but in the short story, the bodies are merely described as lumps of unpleasantness. It's not until Henry heads outside where he realizes the true devastation of what just happened. Henry spends the next few hours trying to find any semblance of the world he knew only moments before, trying to make phone calls, walking to the local bar. Even his own home is nothing more than a pile of rubble and ash.
Helen! Where are you?
As tumultuous as his relationship was with his wife, I still think he loved her, and losing her in an instant could be nothing but devastating. Even with all the destruction around him, it still doesn't really make sense to him why he's alive and everyone else is dead, until he realizes that being inside the bank vault is likely what saved him. However, an intense feeling of dread washes over him, because even though he survived, there's nothing left. Nothing but pure loneliness. He even begins to have thoughts of taking his own life, because what else is there to do? Henry instead finds food at what used to be a supermarket and a random couch to sleep on. Unfortunately for Henry, being caught in the blast may have been better for him, as now he has to deal with nuclear fallout. Back in the day, the effects of nuclear fallout were still being studied and not as understood as they are today, so he likely wouldn't have known that he's actually put himself in more danger by leaving the vault than if he had stayed.
The very worst part is being alone.
As much as Henry liked reading, he still enjoyed being around other people while he read. Have you ever been in a room with someone where you're both doing your own thing but still kind of doing something together? I think that's where Henry's mindset is. When Henry awakes from his sleep, he discovers a car and tries to start it, hoping maybe he can drive away in search of some other people, but like everything else, the car is dead. In his desperation, he shouts and screams for anyone, but realizes he's alone. He does his best to calm himself down and assure himself that he's lucky to be alive, but he's really only fooling himself at this point. As Henry searches for another sign of life, he finds himself at a sporting goods store where he grabs a pistol.
If it just weren't for the loneliness.
It's not even just being alone that has driven him to this point, but also the fact that there's nothing to do. A night out playing cards probably sounds pretty nice right about now, considering what faces him. As Henry brings the gun to his head, he says over and over that he thinks he'll be forgiven for this. I always took this as meaning that he'll be forgiven by God, as taking your life was seen as a sin. Before he can pull the trigger, however, he notices he's right at the foot of the public library. It basically turns into his guardian angel and saving grace, because even though he was about to do the unthinkable, he at least has a reason to live now. All the reading he couldn't do before, and now he has nothing but time. Sure, he might not have people around him, but at least he can stave off the loneliness with books. In the most depressing twist, or one of them anyways, Henry breaks his glasses, the one thing he needed in order to read all his books. This twist was actually briefly foreshadowed earlier in the episode when Henry bent down to grab the torn pages, so even though he has all the time in the world, now he's lost everything. Time Enough at Last is both parts funny and sad. Henry was a simple man who wanted nothing to do but read, and when he's finally afforded the opportunity to do so, just like that, it's all snatched away from him. It's strange to see how everyone treated Henry simply because he wanted to read. Obviously, there's a time and a place, but they all treated the act of reading itself like it was some strange habit only performed by the lowest of class. As technology started to creep more and more into people's homes, the idea of reading became less and less commonplace, and I think Henry comes off as the last of the old guard. Someone who is still holding on to old traditions while the rest of the world moves on without him. As great as this episode is, it's truly held together by the performance from Burgess Meredith, a man who can play off quiet and silly while also extremely sad and lonely. It's fun watching him act so aloof when he's dealing with Mrs. Chester at the bank, but when he's left on his own, with everyone else around him dead, you can really feel just how sorrowful he truly is. There's definitely a case of be careful what you wish for. Burgess Meredith's character and the episode Time Enough at Last were both based on the author of the original short story, Lynn Venable. Lynn, like Henry, was always looking for time to read and also had a fear of breaking her glasses, which she would incorporate into her story. When she wrote her story, she submitted it under the name Lynn instead of her full legal name Marilyn, as it sounded more gender neutral and would have a better chance at being published. Things have definitely progressed since then. Her agent at the time was also legend Forrest J. Ackerman, a man who was a big fan of all things sci-fi and horror and founding editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland. One of my favorite aspects of this episode is the set design. They did a really great job making everything look as if an actual bomb went off. All the buildings are crumbling and burnt, everything's smoky, and there's even some fire here and there. It feels very post-apocalyptic. I also really like the backdrops. Sure, you can tell they are just backdrops in certain shots when he gets really close to them, but there are a few times when they're out of focus or shot in such a way that you don't really notice them where they really shine. The popularity of this episode has led to many, and I mean many, pop culture references over the years. Family Guy did a brief parody of it with Peter Griffin's last surviving brain cell.
No, that's not fair.
The Simpsons, of course, did a brief parody in the season 14 episode Strong Arms of the Maw.
Woo! Twilight Zone magazine. Oh no, my glasses are broken.
Futurama had a parody of the episode as well in its Twilight Zone / Outer Limits knockoff show called The Scary Door.
Wait, my eyes aren't that bad. I can still read the large print books.
Time Enough at Last is one of the best episodes in the show's history, and that's saying a lot considering there are a lot of stellar episodes. But what do you think of it? Let me know down in the comments. Anyways, that's all for today. I hope you're having a great day and stay spooky.